On Peter Ives' 2024 book, Rethinking Free Speech. I recommend buying it. So just a little bit. So how we're doing this is Peter will go first to provide approximately a 10-minute introduction and overview to his book. Okay, let's get started.
Okay, so I wanted to thank the Society for Social Studies and for all of you for being here, and especially to Hillary for initially suggesting the idea of this panel, and then to Shannon, Sean, and Honor for agreeing to be on the panel. It's a great honor to have them talk about my work and this book. There is a land acknowledgement in the program, so I won't repeat that here now. I did want to sort of say that if you'd asked me 10 years ago whether I'd be writing a book on free speech, I never would have said I would. It seems strange to me. My work is mostly on Antonio Gramsci and his focus on language and Italian language standardization and the politics of language, as well as he studied linguistics at the University of Turin, so sort of the ambit from which Ferdinand de Saussure and the linguistics produced structuralism. And then I've done lots of work on the politics of global English. So I tend to see language as a more social, communal structures of communication. But the politics of, initially it was the Lindsay Shepherd Affair, Wilfrid Laurier University in 2017, and then lots of other sort of current events that sort of, the book chose me, I didn't choose the book. And in that sense, those conjunctures were sort of very important. And so the book, in a certain sense, starts off from that conversation emanating, which is, and I don't know how many of you remember it, but for some of it's burned into our memories, because there was this very weird, the details are very important, but there was a national conversation in Canada with, every major newspaper and magazine, Maclean's, decrying the crisis of free speech on university campuses in Canada, precisely based upon what a TA had done in a classroom, right? And so there were a couple people who sort of said, well, this isn't really free speech, it's academic freedom, which seemed totally obvious to me, and I was invited to give a talk at the University of Winnipeg that the rhetoric department had hosted, and it seemed very odd that seemed to be a controversial statement, right? Sort of this distinction between free expression and academic freedom seemed to be news, and obviously there's much more to say than that, and Chapter 3 of the book is about academic freedom, and I should actually back up a bit and say it's about the argument that there's a distinction between free expression and academic freedom. And to some extent that sort of builds off work by a lot of American scholars like Joan Waller-Scott and Michael Berube and Jennifer Ruth, who have made this argument in the American context. It quite stunned me, and I grew up in the United States, and so it was very interesting to me, and I sort of had an inkling before, but it became very clear upon doing just even a bit of research how different the Canadian context is than the American context, in that since the 1930s, the US Supreme Court has been tying academic freedom to the First Amendment. And there are good and positive things that come out of doing that, but in Canada, the Canadian Supreme Court has never linked academic freedom to free expression, and academic freedom is a creature of our collective agreements at universities, right? So the legal context and terrain are very different, which then makes it much more troubling, perhaps, that in Alberta and Ontario, the premiers sort of adopted the Chicago principles, so the statement from 2014 from the University of Chicago, which is sort of a free speech absolutist, free speech on campus declaration. And so, even that importation is questionable, and even the document from an American standpoint is questionable, but it makes, my argument anyway in the book, is that it makes very little sense in the Canadian context. And that does lead me to some questions I'd like to talk about today, which are, and the book was basically finished, the main manuscript was finished before the events of October 7th, 2023, but it's precisely in the things that are happening in the US that are draconian and frightening, and then the sort of the censorship of pro-Palestinian positions, which well predate October 7th, 2023 in Canada and the US. where this thing gets even more important to make these distinctions. And so quite often there's this narrative which is the left in the 1960s were the ones who were pro-free speech, and it was the conservatives' rights who were against it. And then somehow the left lost their way, and it was the right wing who took up this idea of free speech. And then with the attack on the pro-Palestinian students mostly, that the left have refound and rediscovered their belief in free expression. And that sort of narrative, I think, is problematic on a whole bunch of fronts, one of which is it totally ignores the suppression of pro-Palestinian voices that has been going on long before October 7th, 2023. I think it also then equates things about what I think the sort of progressive liberal and progressive left have been saying about on university campuses. We shouldn't have speakers who are openly white supremacists and anti-trans, and those types of content was the issue at stake. And to have this narrative that this principle just shifts back and forth between the left and the right, confuses the actual content and says that, critiquing the state of Israel for enacting a genocide is equivalent or it's comparable to ideas about transphobia and white supremacy and colonialism. So it's those two things that I think come out of that chapter. But that chapter then, and it was actually the events of January 6th, 2021, and after the Trumpians' assault on the White House and the Capitol, not the White House, but the Capitol, that when he was banned from the then Twitter and Facebook and took them to court based upon the First Amendment, and there's this huge, and legally, all the legal scholars says this is ridiculous. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Twitter and Facebook on Congress, it's obviously thrown out of court, right? But in the popular imagination, it was seen as a ploy or a tactic, but it also confused these two. When you have this over and over again, you had Josh Hawley, who did a very similar thing, who brought up the idea of the First Amendment as protecting more than it does, right? And so, to some extent, the whole idea of the book is to disambiguate the different ideas that we think of when we think of free expression or free speech, and I use those synonymously. And the big one is one that often, most people will accept, that there's the legal notion that we have in Canada. The Charter right of free expression is a protection that individuals have against the government and government intrusion, and that's quite different from the sort of cultural sense of wanting to have a good discussion, right? And wanting to have a discussion where people don't feel that they have to self-censor or think too hard about what they're going to say in terms of offending other people. And we can have disagreements about both of those things. In the States, the legal precedent is there that having laws against hate speech is unconstitutional. In Canada, of course, it is constitutional to have hate speech laws. So there's differences upon that, but that's all about the state and the individual. And that's all premised upon the state should be drawing the lines based upon not whether what I'm saying is good or is true or has any value. I should be able to say ridiculous things, and to have the state, come down on me for that is draconian. But if I'm saying things that are harmful to others, that's where the state has a role. That's very different from questions of how we have conversations in public, right? So that's sort of the basic distinction, but then I sort of go more into, and to some extent, I first talked about my earlier work on Antonio Gramsci, and I don't mention Gramsci in the book. That was actually hard. I have to keep on saying, I'm not going to do that, not going to go there. But I do, especially after the fact, looking at it, I see it as a very Gramscian project of looking at dominant discourses or the common sense of free expression and trying to disambiguate those things. And then especially trying to ask that question of, so if free expression, I guess one of the things that kept on irritating me so much was this notion that it's self-evident why free expression is important, and yet seeing different rationales for why free expression is important, right? And the most classic one is that it gets us to the truth. But I argue, and it's, you can look at lots of different scholarly work as well as different popular work as well as the ACLU and other organizations, which will say that free expression gives us, is important for self-expression, sort of individual self-expression. Expressing ourselves is just inherently a thing that's important. It's also important for democracy, and it's also important to discover the truth. And these are the three basic, the sort of triptych that I argue that most of the academic and non-academic literature doesn't really investigate how these things are actually different. And so I sort of look at the dominant Western traditions that say that they do all these things, they do them together, and see that actually people like John Stuart Mill, who's the classic figure who argues that it's to get to the truth that's important. Well, he wasn't interested in democratic will formation in the way that somebody like Alexander Meiklejohn was. And for him, the truth wasn't important, it's democracy that's important, right? And then I look at a more contemporary philosopher who most people probably haven't heard of, C. Edmund Baker, who argues explicitly against the other two, saying that it's about self-expression, right? And these three thinkers see these as very different positions, and they have very different implications in terms of what counts as free speech and why it's important. So the book basically sort of disambiguates those different positions. Doesn't necessarily, although I do take lots of jabs at John Stuart Mill and that sort of, and then I take that up through this. It's actually a really terrible metaphor of the marketplace of ideas, which makes no sense as a metaphor, and yet it's been so prominent and so influential, and yet I argue it's sort of nonsensical. But I disambiguate those and say that then, free speech in a certain sense, the problem is, and there's left-wing critics, Pete Moskovich is a great one, Anthony Leaker, who, critique free speech absolutism, but they sort of say it's empty, it's a veil, it's just there to mask. And I agree with a lot of their specific analyses, but I think we need to take the opposite task and say the problem is that it does too much, and the different concepts are actually conflated with each other. It's not that there's too little there, it's that there's too much there, and that they're contradictory. That's sort of the heart of the book, and then I have the book on the chapter on academic freedom that distinguishes free speech from academic freedom, and then the terrain of social media, which is probably the most complex set of questions. So that's why I'll stop before I have to say anything about that. And I will turn it over to the rest of you, but thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay.
The beginnings of the book started off in 2017 when the case of Lindsay Shepherd came up. She was a TA at Wilfrid Laurier University, and she famously showed a clip from the TVO show in which Jordan Peterson argued against the use of pronouns. He thought it was against his free speech to be told that he should address students by the pronouns that they preferred. And he had various other claims about a bill that has now become law that changed the criminal code and the human rights code in Canada. Lots of material said that he misunderstood it and misinterpreted it, but that wasn't really the issue. The issue was that she showed it in a tutorial within a university course, a first-year course in communications, that was scheduled to be about grammar, and so it was about grammar because it's about pronouns, but it was also, the setup of the course was that the discussion period of the tutorial was to be about the lecture, which was on digitization and globalization. So Lindsay Shepherd showed this video, and then there was a discussion that some of the students in the class were uncomfortable about. They didn't make a formal complaint, but they did complain to the Rainbow Resource Center, and they told both the professor and then the program director, and they called for a meeting with Lindsay Shepherd to basically get her side of the situation, and she didn't tell them, but she was recording it, and then she gave that recording to Christy Blatchford, who published it in the National Post, and it became a huge discussion throughout Canada of how the left wasn't allowing free speech on university campuses. So there was the editorial of the Globe and Mail, and there was a big article in Maclean's, CBC weighed in, Rick Mercer's, the sort of comedy Rick's Rant had a whole thing on it about how terrible it was that we lived in this condition, at universities where there was no free speech anymore, and university students were supposed to be protected from this type of challenging ideas. That was sort of the public conversation, but it was all confused because it was all gauged in the concept of free speech or free expression, and yet in our classrooms, just like in our workplaces, we don't have free speech. It's not, like, it was unclear whether they meant a charter right of free expression, which is normally a protection from a government, or sort of some general notion of we have an ideal that we should be able to speak freely and critically. Regardless, in a university classroom, if you're trying to teach something, you know, the professor traditionally gets to say what goes on and how our collective agreements work. And in this case, sort of the professor ran the course as a whole, and then the tutorial assistant, in this case Lindsay Shepard, was a TA, and then she had some leeway within that, right? So the situation wasn't what the public discussion was about, right? And so, you know, myself and others sort of looked at it from a distance. I wasn't involved, but I am a teacher, so I'm a university professor, so I worry about my classroom having to, like, if I have some idea that all my students have some type of free expression and they get to say what they want in any class that I give, is, you know, how can I get the material that I'm paid to convey to them if I have to allow that, if that's what free expression is, right? So there was this huge discussion that I found very confusing in terms of people just not sort of expanding this idea of, and the sort of ideals of we should all be able to speak freely, and obviously we're trying to get our students to look at all sides of an issue and be critical, but all of that takes a structure, right? And free speech as a concept doesn't really get at that in a way that academic freedom does. So, and in Canada, the academic freedom is something that only professors have, so teaching assistants don't have academic freedom in Canada. And if the public discussion was, well, maybe TAs should have more academic freedom, that would have been a very different discussion and potentially much more productive. Whereas it was just weaponized into this, you know, sort of right-wing free speech absolutism, and this claim, which is totally false, which is this left, you know, university campuses are overrun by left-wing censorship, right? That was sort of this totally simplified public discussion that was totally unproductive because it was not understanding what it was even talking about. I mean, one of the things that the book started with was this idea that academic freedom is clearly different from free speech. One of the clear differences in the idea of free speech as it is in the US First Amendment or the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, free expression, is the idea that the government should be able to censor people or the subjects, the people it rules, unless what they're saying is hurting people, right? And the parameters for that, what constitutes hurt, are different in the US than in Canada. Famously, Canada has laws against hate speech, so denying the Holocaust or calling for genocide for a specific group of people is seen as hate speech, and it's illegal in Canada, and it's not illegal in the US. It's called protected speech under the First Amendment. So there's obvious differences, but even then, the whole point is that the government shouldn't be judging the content of the speech beyond whether it harms other people or not, like whether it's ridiculous, whether it's false. Those types of issues, are not the government. That's not a good reason for the government to censor speech. Whereas academic freedom is obviously different because it's something that professors have. So, it would be draconian if I lived in a society where lying to my neighbors was an offense that the government would punish me for. Like, it might be inconsequential. I might not want them to know where I'm going on vacation or whatever. That shouldn't be an issue. But lying to my students should be seen as a problem for me as a professor, right? And lecturing on things that I know are false. Again, so that's where the content matters for academic freedom. And academic freedom works upon a sort of collegial governance system where it is your discipline. So my discipline of political science will have different requirements in how we judge that content versus how sociology or English literature or mathematics or biology judge what is appropriate and what is not. And academic freedom doesn't give me the license to say whatever I want as long as it doesn't harm people. It gives me the license to pursue my research and my teaching in vigorous, critical ways, and I can critique the government, I can critique my university, I can critique the powers that be, and so they're very different conceptually, the two ideas. But one of the things that really intrigues me, and that I discovered much more of the intricacies of in writing the book, was, and I grew up in the US, so I had some of the background here, but in the US, the US Supreme Court has connected academic freedom both to high school teachers as well as university professors, and they've connected it through the First Amendment to free speech, going back to the 1930s, and explicitly in the McCarthy era of the 1950s. In Canada, it's very different because the Supreme Court has not connected academic freedom to our charter right of free expression. And so this is a legal difference, and we can argue about whether it's good or bad, whether we should try to fight in Canada to have it connected, but right now it's legally not connected. And then the other part of that is that in Canada, our university professoriate is much more unionized than in the States. So our academic freedom is seen through our collective agreements, which I argue sort of makes sense because it is a condition for us to do our work, right? It's not something that's an individual right. It's something that's a tool that I need in order to be able to be an adequate professor. So that's one of the key differences that I make, and that has important implications when what happened in Ontario and Alberta, where the premiers, at the time it was Doug Ford and Jason Kenney, and they imposed the American document, what's called the Chicago Principles. So it was a document that was created at the University of Chicago in 2014, and it actually didn't go through the University of Chicago Senate or anything. It was just the president created a task force that basically put forth a very free speech absolutist position, saying that free speech is essential to what universities do, and that position was adopted by Ontario and Alberta and said that all public universities have to live up to those goals and their funding depends upon it, right? And so then the legal differences become very important in that why are we importing American documents anyway? Aren't there similar ones in Canada that would make more sense? And then, for example, the Chicago Principles doesn't mention academic freedom, doesn't mention academic unions. All of that's absent, and so there's a huge difference there in the context between Canada and the U.S. Obviously, one of the big topics that sometimes we, I think, problematically think of has really only come to the fore since October 7th, 2023, and then the Israeli repercussions on the attack of Hamas on Israel, and then the ongoing genocide, is the suppression of Palestinian solidarity, especially, but not only on university campuses. And one of the issues there is that I guess the big issue is the disjuncture. So you have the mainstream following the right-wing free speech absolutist position, and you have the Chicago Principles that basically has this position that the only response to speech that you find problematic or hurtful is more speech. And that's sort of the free speech idea that people can say what they want, and then as long as somebody can counter them, then the better argument will rise to the top, and that's sort of the idealistic model that I'm criticizing throughout a lot of the book in different ways. But it's very important here because for decades, from in the 2010s and the early 2020s, the argument was that racialized students on campuses needed to hear white supremacist arguments, and arguments that have been debunked for hundreds of years about why white people are smarter than non-white people, or arguments that trans people shouldn't have rights and that trans people don't exist, and and that type of really hurtful, hugely harmful ideas that you can understand if you're a student in that position, you would be made very, very uncomfortable on campus. And the right-wing response, which was then adopted by a lot of the mainstream and the people who were upset that Lindsay Shepherd was silenced, their argument was anything should be allowed in universities, and if you don't like it, as long as it's not violence, in Canada, as long as it's not hate speech, but in the US it could include hate speech. But the idea was, as long as there's a space for counter speech, then that's fine. And that's what we were hearing until we had, and I would say this goes back to, certainly to the anti-Israeli apartheid weeks, well before 2023, but there was this sort of an exceptionalism that somehow, and normally it's phrased as if Jewish students are made uncomfortable because of what's called anti-Semitism, then that's terrible and we can't allow that, right? And of course, when I say Jewish students, I don't mean Jewish students because there's tons of Jewish students who are involved in the pro-Palestinian protests, who are organizing them. So it's really Zionism, right? So it's the Zionist students who the argument was, were being made uncomfortable by these protests. And then there's interpretations on whether the river to the sea is inherently a statement that makes a certain group of students uncomfortable, right? And it did seem that somehow if something makes you uncomfortable, then more speech is the answer. That wasn't the notion. The notion was, we need to silence the terrorist pro-Palestinian activism, right? So obviously that's, you could say that there was a switch in the terrain around free speech on campus and protests and what's allowed and what's not. But one of the things the book does is it really tries to say that there's not one principle of free speech. There's different principles of free speech. So academic freedom is, sort of tangential to free speech in ways that I've just explained, but separable. But there's also whether free speech is, with the goal of free speech is to create new knowledge. That's a certain type of free speech and has certain implications for what counts as free speech and what doesn't and where. If it is just about individual expression, that's a different concept of free speech. And then if it's about democracy and informing the public and public will formation. So I sort of disambiguate those different goals of free speech, and I argue that where many sort of conflate them and argue that they're complementary and they all fit together in a single principle of free speech, my argument is these are actually different principles. So given that, the narrative that the left sort of lost its way on free speech and accepted cancel culture and was trying to censor people and had lost sometimes the narrative is that in the golden years of the 1960s the left was correct in embracing free speech, but then they sort of lost their way and it was the right which took up free speech in the 2010s and the 2020s, and then with the outbreak of the Israeli hostilities, it switched sides again. That whole narrative is premised upon the notion that there is one principle of free speech that the left and the right could switch on, right? And my argument is that it's not one principle, it's several principles. Sometimes there's overlap, sometimes there's not. And I think that the Palestinian, obviously what's at stake here is so important, and I don't want to lose sight of that, but it's also a clear example of, in order for that narrative to work, you have to forget all the Palestinian solidarity suppression that happened before October 2023, and that Palestine has always been an exception, and that suppression has been going on for a lot longer, and it also creates an equation between the military acts of genocide and war with and being against that, I guess, and sort of, Palestinian solidarity is an act of, solidarity against colonialism and violence, which is quite different than all of the other issues wrapped up in the culture wars and the cancel culture wars and the free speech controversies that are equated with that. too much specifically about cancel culture, but one of the main things I'm concerned with, I mean, I get, and there's been lots of different places throughout history and different societies where we might want and feel that we should be able to have better open discussions with different people, and we should be able to speak our minds, we should be able to be critical, we should hear diverse opinions, and this is what often gets encapsulated with the demand for, or the urge for, free speech, right? But those ideas, which I think we all experience and we all can want, and they're good things to want and we should fight for, but that's very different from the legal notion of free expression, which is about a citizen or an individual and a government, right? That's much more about a social conversation, right? And so the interesting thing about cancel culture as a term is the way it came up to describe. I mean, one could argue that every conversation anybody's ever had, there's always been a sense of who are you talking to and who has power in that conversation, and if you want to get your idea across, do you phrase it politely? Are you allowed to swear? I mean, I use sort of these might seem trivial points, but this idea that we couch how we speak depending upon the environment which we're in that's human communication. We've always done that. And so, sure, we can sociologically say that there have been cultural shifts, and maybe that's been closed down, and maybe all of the news discussions about Thanksgiving in the U.S. in the era of Trump, where people can't talk to each other anymore. These are very real concerns and real experiences, but they have very little to do with the First Amendment and questions of the state, and those questions of free speech. And it's all sort of lumped together as if it's this sort of crisis of cancel culture, when it's actually the plea for a better conversation. And if a better conversation is what we want, then we do need to think about diversity and how, if you bully minorities, they're not going to feel comfortable in speaking in those types of conversations. And so, that being wrapped up in problems of the First Amendment is going to muddy the waters and basically asks us to, it's the groundwork on which free speech becomes weaponized, and ironically closes down the conversation. So the plea for free speech gets weaponized, and I give lots of examples in the book, including the Joe Rogan, Neil Young debate over Spotify, about what constitutes free speech, and they're basically just talking past each other because they have different definitions of free speech. So again, the public discussion around that is often portrayed exactly as you portrayed it, in which the university invites a speaker onto campus. And to me, having been working at the university for 30 years now, there's a huge difference between who on the university is doing the inviting, and normally cancel, I think, my mother taught me that once you invite somebody to dinner, disinviting them is rude, and I would say that that's true, and that's one of the dynamics of cancel culture, that they always have to get the invitation first before the cancellation. But it's exactly that dynamic that plays into this idea of free speech, because and you see this all the time, where these figures who are hardly silenced, most of the time they're right-wing figures who have huge platforms, whether it's podcasts, whether it's other media platforms, and the argument is that they're being canceled and silenced, even though they're not silenced, because we hear all about it, and they go off and they have venues. There's lots of other venues in which these ideas are expressed. So there's no silencing going on in the literal sense of the term. But more than that, universities are prestigious places, and so if you get an invitation to the platform, that's an invitation. It's not a free speech situation. It's a situation where there's a reason we invited you, and there's always should be a reason to invite anybody to speak somewhere at a university, if we take universities seriously. Not everybody, we don't let everybody go up to the podium. So then the question is, and in the States, quite often, it was often right-wing and sometimes student organizations, but to me, all the details about Is it a department within the university that has a speaker series and they're inviting somebody? And what are their terms of that invitation? And that's quite different than if it's a student group, and if the student group is renting the room from the university. Like, all of these nuances are lost in all of these high-profile controversial cases, and we don't hear the story leading up to, and most of the time it's straight out of the right-wing playbook, where they want to invite the most controversial, preferably anti-trans or racist, or white supremacist, or anti-immigrant speaker who creates the controversy, right? And to some extent, depending on the speaker series, like, I think there's lots of space for universities to do lots of different things, but we generally think of inviting experts who have knowledge, and again, this gets to the content part that I was talking about with academic freedom, and we normally give the privilege to people who have done research to back up their arguments, and it's not just that they have arguments, but they have backed them up in an academic way, and it's that conflation that normally is being made when you have these high-profile situations of somebody being canceled. And so it is that prestige factor of the university that I think we need to think more thoroughly through. And at my university, when one of these events happened, again, it often goes up to the president's office. Well, I don't think the president's office should be making these claims, these determinations of what should or shouldn't go on. But I do think the faculty, if it's an academic talk, should be held accountable for on what basis did you invite this person, and what is their research, and what is the status of the arguments they're making. The concluding chapter of the book is on social media, which is arguably the thing that has changed the terrain of the debate so much in the last 20 years, especially in the last 10 years maybe. Freedom of the press is only useful if you have a press, right? But now we all have a press because we have a phone in our pocket, right? And so we can, the ideal is that we can tweet out to the world and everybody will read it. But we all know that social media doesn't work like that, and that social media companies wouldn't be making the buckets of money that they're making if they couldn't manipulate those tweets, right? So Facebook will tell us that they're a communications company and they allow us to communicate, and then they just sell ads on the side, and that's how they fund it. But that's obviously not what's going on. What's going on is that users don't pay anything, but we can tweet, we can put our posts up, but it's surveillance capitalism, and the book isn't on that, and there's lots of great research on that, and it's an important area, but where it comes into contact with free speech is this idea that we pretend that the internet is an area of free speech, and I argue it's not. It's just like every other media, it's structured, right? And the particular structuring of social media companies is the famous Section 230 of the American Communications Act that allows social media the special place between publishers who are liable for what they print. So if I slander you in a newspaper, you can sue me and the newspaper because they curated it. They're also responsible. But if I slander you on the telephone, you can't sue the telephone company because they didn't curate it, right? They don't reach into what we're saying on the telephone and manipulate it. They just let us say whatever, so they're not responsible. And the famous situation in the 1990s, before social media had emerged, was, well, what do we do with all these bulletin boards, and where's the internet in this model? And Section 230 gave social media the exception. So they can both do what phone companies or the mail companies or couriers can't do, which is manipulate the content of what we're trying to, use them to carry. And they're not liable for the content, but they can manipulate it, like a newspaper that gets to curate our letters to the editor or whatever we write in the newspaper, right? So it's only that sweet spot, which is the structuring of social media, which allows surveillance capitalism to be so profitable, and why Meta and X are all very worried that the Section 230 would be replaced with something that wasn't so convenient for them. And so that's another good example of the way that we have this simplistic idea of free speech, which is overly simplistic, and it doesn't really work like that.